Alright guys, buckle up because today we're diving into something that the entire K-pop world has been whispering about for years, but nobody ever dared to lay it all out on the table like this. Mr. Lee, one of the most well-connected entertainment insiders in South Korea, a man who has spent over 2 decades navigating the corridors of the Korean entertainment industry, has finally broken his silence, and what he revealed is nothing short of jaw-dropping. We're talking about the personal lives of the 7 members of BTS, the group that literally redefined global pop culture, sold out stadiums on every continent, addressed the United Nations, and became the first Korean act to top the Billboard Hot 100. But behind those flashing lights, behind those perfectly choreographed performances and those heartfelt lyrics that made millions cry, there were real human beings with real emotions, real connections, and yes, real relationships. Now here's the thing, in the K-pop industry, dating has always been treated like a forbidden territory, almost like a career death sentence, and yet love doesn't care about contracts or public image, does it? So the question is, who were these people that allegedly captured the hearts of each BTS member? Were they fellow idols? Actresses? Someone completely outside the industry? And why did Mr. Lee choose now of all times to reveal this? What changed? Was there a reason these stories were buried for so long? And most importantly, how did these relationships shape the music, the lyrics, and the emotional depth that made BTS resonate with over 90 million fans worldwide? Trust me, some of these names will genuinely shock you, some will make total sense in hindsight, and at least one of them will make you go back and re-listen to an entire album with completely new ears. We've got 7 members, 7 stories, 7 revelations, counting down from number 7 all the way to number 1. So if you think you know everything about BTS, think again, because this list is about to change the way you see them forever. Are you ready? Let's get into it. Number 7. J-Hope, the secret romance that fueled his brightest smile. Now before you say anything, yes, we're starting this countdown with none other than young Hoseok, the man the world knows as J-Hope, BTS's eternal sunshine, the guy who can light up an entire stadium with nothing but his energy, and honestly, if you think his love life was as simple and straightforward as a smile, you're in for a real surprise right now. According to Mr. Lee, J-Hope was allegedly involved in a quiet, deeply personal relationship with a woman who worked not as an idol, not as an actress, but as a contemporary dance instructor based in Gwangju, his hometown. Someone he had known long before big hit entertainment ever entered the picture. And when Mr. Lee dropped this detail, it honestly made so much sense because if you've ever followed J-Hope's story closely, you'd know that dance wasn't just a career choice for him. It was literally his entire identity, his soul, his way of breathing. And the idea that he connected with someone who shared that same sacred language of movement is poetic in a way that words can barely capture. Let's rewind a little bit to understand why this hits so deep. Young Hoseok grew up in Gwangju, a city in the southwestern part of South Korea known for its rich cultural heritage, its fierce spirit of independence, and ironically, its thriving underground dance scene. Before he was J-Hope, before the Billboard records and the Grammy nominations, he was just a kid who fell in love with street dance, popping and locking in local academies, competing in regional competitions, and earning a reputation as one of the most talented young dancers in the entire Gwangju scene. He was part of a street dance crew, he won national competitions, and his talent was so undeniable that when Big Hit came scouting for trainees, Hoseok was a no-brainer pick. But here's the thing nobody really talks about. During those formative years, the dance academy scene in Gwangju wasn't just about learning choreography, it was a tight-knit community. A family of people who understood each other on a level that outsiders simply couldn't, and according to Mr. Lee, it was in this exact environment that Hoseok allegedly met her. Mr. Lee described her as someone who was a few years older than Hoseok, a trained contemporary dancer who had studied at one of Korea's prestigious arts universities before returning to Gwangju to teach at a local academy. She wasn't chasing fame. She wasn't interested in the idol world. She was someone who genuinely loved the art of dance in its purest form, and that's apparently what drew Hoseok to her. Their connection allegedly began during his pre-debut days, somewhere around 2009 to 2010, when Hoseok was still a teenager navigating the confusing crossroads between pursuing dance as an art and entering the brutal K-pop trainee system. According to Mr. Lee, she was one of the few people who actually encouraged him to audition for Big Hit, believing that his talent deserved a bigger stage, even though it meant he would leave Gwangju and, inevitably, leave her behind too. Now here's where it gets really emotional. If you look at J-Hope's early music, especially his mixtape, Hope World, released in 2018, there are layers of nostalgia woven into almost every track that most fans attributed to general homesickness or the pressure of fame. But Mr. Lee suggests there's something far more personal buried in those lyrics. Take the track Baseline, for example, where Hoseok raps about his roots, his foundation, the thing that keeps him grounded no matter how high he flies. Most people interpreted that as a reference to dance itself or to his family, but according to Mr. Lee, the bass line was also a metaphor for this person, the one who represented his origin, his beginning. The emotional anchor that kept him connected to who he really was before the world started calling him J-Hope. And if you listen to PP, Piece of Peace, from the same mixtape, there's a recurring theme of finding peace in simplicity, in honest human connection rather than material success. And Mr. Lee alleges that these sentiments were directly influenced by conversations Hoseok had with this woman during late-night phone calls even after he debuted. What makes this story particularly fascinating from an industry perspective is how Mr. Lee described the way Hoseok allegedly handled this relationship within the rigid structure of Big Hit's management. Unlike some idols who try to sneak around or create elaborate cover stories, Hoseok apparently took a very mature, almost philosophical approach. According to Mr. Lee, Hoseok understood early on that the trainee-to-idol pipeline was designed to consume every ounce of personal life, and rather than fighting against it or risking a scandal that could hurt the group, he allegedly chose to keep this connection in a space that existed outside the idol framework entirely. It wasn't a traditional relationship in the way most people would define it. It was more like an emotional partnership. Two people who deeply cared about each other, but accepted that timing and circumstance had placed them on different paths. And honestly, when you think about it, that level of emotional maturity from someone who was barely 20 years old at the time is remarkable. Mr. Lee also revealed an interesting detail about how this connection allegedly influenced J-Hope's approach to choreography and performance. Anyone who watches BTS closely knows that J-Hope's dance style is unique within the group. It's sharper, more technical, more rooted in street dance fundamentals than the typical K-pop choreography. And Mr. Lee suggests that part of this was because Hoseok continued to seek artistic feedback from this woman even during BTS's active years. She would allegedly watch their performances and send him detailed notes, not as a fan, but as a fellow dancer, critiquing his form, suggesting improvements, pushing him to maintain the artistic integrity that first brought them together. In an industry where most idols are surrounded by yes men and corporate handlers, having someone who treated him as an equal artist rather than a celebrity must have been incredibly grounding. The alleged relationship reportedly reached a natural conclusion sometime around 2016 to 2017 as BTS began their meteoric rise to global superstardom with the Wings era and the Love Yourself series. Mr. Lee didn't frame it as a breakup in the dramatic sense, but rather as a mutual understanding that their worlds had diverged too far. She remained in Gwangju, continued teaching dance, continued living a quiet life dedicated to her art, while Hoseok became one of the most recognized faces on the planet. But here's the beautiful part. Mr. Lee claims that even after things ended, Hoseok allegedly continued to support the dance academy she worked at through anonymous donations, making sure that the place where he first discovered his passion, and allegedly his first real emotional connection, would continue to thrive for future generations of dancers. If that doesn't tell you everything about the kind of person young Hoseok is beneath the stage persona, I don't know what will. And you know what? Maybe that's why J-Hope's smile has always felt so genuine, so warm, so different from the manufactured expressions you see on so many idol faces, because behind that smile was a man who had experienced real, quiet, selfless love. The kind that doesn't need headlines or fan theories to validate its existence. The kind that simply lives in the space between two people who once shared a dance floor and a dream. That's number 7, folks, and honestly, we're just getting started because if you think this story was emotional, wait until you hear who allegedly captured the heart of the member coming in at number 6. Because Mr. Lee says this next one involves a connection so unexpected, so completely out of left field, that even the most dedicated fans never saw it coming. Stay right here. Number 6. Suga. The midnight connection that nobody expected. Alright, if number 7 had you in your feelings, then what Mr. Lee revealed about Min Yoongi, the man the world calls Suga, the genius producer behind some of the most gut-wrenching, soul-piercing music to ever come out of the K-pop industry, is going to hit you in a completely different way because this one isn't a story about sweetness or quiet affection. This one is raw, complicated, and deeply intertwined with the darkness and brilliance that made August D one of the most respected musical personas in modern Korean music. According to Mr. Lee, Suga was allegedly connected to a female songwriter and lyricist who worked in the Korean indie music scene, someone who existed entirely outside the glittering, manufactured world of K-pop. Someone who wrote music in dimly lit studios at 3 in the morning and understood the kind of pain that Min Yoongi had been carrying since long before the world ever learned his name. To truly understand why this revelation resonates so deeply, you have to go back to Daegu, the city that shaped Min Yoongi into the artist he is today. Born in 1993 into a family that wasn't wealthy by any stretch of the imagination, Yoongi grew up in a working-class neighborhood where pursuing music was considered not just impractical, but borderline irresponsible. His parents wanted stability for him, a regular job, a predictable life, and young Yoongi understood their fears because he lived in them too. But music had already claimed him. By the time he was in middle school, he was writing lyrics in secret notebooks, studying the structure of hip-hop beats, and teaching himself how to produce using pirated software on a barely functioning computer. He worked part-time jobs to afford equipment. He performed at underground rap battles in Daegu, and he built a reputation under the name Gloss before eventually catching the attention of Big Hit Entertainment. But here's what most people don't realize. The journey from Daegu's underground scene to becoming a Big Hit trainee wasn't a straight line. It was a winding, painful road filled with rejection, self-doubt, and a deep, almost crippling battle with depression and anxiety that Yoongi has spoken about publicly on multiple occasions. According to Mr. Lee, it was during this turbulent period, specifically around 2010 to 2011, just before and during his early trainee days, that Yoongi allegedly crossed paths with this songwriter. She was reportedly active in Hongdae's indie music circuit, a scene that has always operated as the creative counterculture to mainstream K-pop, a place where artists wrote about real life, real struggle, real emotion without the filter of corporate branding. Mr. Lee described her as someone in her early 20s at the time, a lyricist who contributed to various indie bands and solo artists, someone who had a reputation for writing devastatingly honest words about loneliness, mental health, and the quiet desperation of trying to make art in a world that constantly demands you monetize your soul. And if you're already connecting the dots to Yoongi's own artistic philosophy, you're seeing exactly what Mr. Lee was pointing at. Their connection allegedly wasn't romantic in the traditional candlelight dinner, holding hands in the park kind of way. Mr. Lee was very specific about this. What they shared was more like an intellectual and emotional collision, two people who recognized their own wounds in each other's words and found a strange, almost therapeutic comfort in that mutual understanding. According to Mr. Lee, they would allegedly spend hours in small, cramped studios in the Mapo-gu district of Seoul, not necessarily writing together, but existing in the same creative space, feeding off each other's energy, challenging each other's perspectives on what music was supposed to do and who it was supposed to serve. She allegedly pushed Yoongi to stop apologizing for his darkness, to stop trying to make his pain palatable for the mainstream, and instead to weaponize it, to turn it into something so brutally honest that people would have no choice but to listen. And if you've ever wondered where the unflinching rawness of August D's first mixtape came from, Mr. Lee suggests that at least part of that creative courage was born in those late-night sessions with this woman. Now here's where the story takes a particularly interesting turn from an industry analysis perspective. When BTS debuted in June 2013, the group was positioned as a hip-hop idol group, something that was relatively unusual in the K-pop landscape at the time. Big Hit gave them more creative freedom than most agencies offered their rookies, and Suga, along with RM, became the primary driving forces behind BTS's lyrical identity. But according to Mr. Lee, the early days of BTS were incredibly stressful for Yoongi, not just because of the physical demands of idol life, but because he felt a growing tension between the artist he wanted to be and the product the industry needed him to be. He was writing about social commentary, mental health, and class inequality while being asked to also smile for cameras, do variety show EGO, and participate in the very idol culture he had once criticized as an underground rapper. Mr. Lee alleges that during this period, the songwriter was one of the very few people Yoongi could be completely transparent with about these internal conflicts, and she reportedly told him something that stuck with him for years afterward. Something along the lines of, the system doesn't have to change you, you can change the system, but only if you survive long enough inside it to do so. That alleged piece of advice is haunting when you consider the trajectory of BTS's discography. From the School trilogy to the Most Beautiful Moment in Life series to Wings and eventually the Love Yourself era, BTS didn't just survive the K-pop system, they fundamentally transformed it. They proved that idol music could be deeply personal, politically aware, and emotionally sophisticated without sacrificing commercial appeal. And while that transformation was obviously a collective effort involving all 7 members and a brilliant production team, Mr. Lee suggests that the philosophical foundation, particularly Suga's insistence on authenticity and his refusal to separate his art from his pain, was influenced in no small part by this connection. The alleged relationship reportedly began to fade around 2014 to 2015, not because of any dramatic falling out, but because their lives were moving at completely different speeds. BTS was gaining momentum, touring more frequently, recording constantly, and Yoongi's schedule became the kind of relentless machine that leaves no room for anything outside its gears. She continued working in the indie scene, continued writing quietly, and according to Mr. Lee, eventually moved away from Seoul altogether, settling in a smaller city where she could create without the noise of the capital. But Mr. Lee revealed one final detail that honestly gave me chills when I heard it. He claims that when Suga released his first August D mixtape in 2016, a project widely regarded as one of the most important solo works in K-pop history, he allegedly sent her a copy before it went public, not asking for approval or feedback, but simply as an acknowledgement, a silent way of saying, "You helped me find the courage to make this, and I want you to hear it first." If you listen to tracks like The Last from that mixtape, where Yoongi raps with terrifying vulnerability about his battles with depression, obsessive-compulsive disorder, and social anxiety, knowing this alleged backstory adds an entirely new dimension to the music. It's not just an artist confessing to the public, it's a man who allegedly learned from someone that confession itself is an act of strength, that bearing your wounds doesn't make you weak, it makes you unbreakable. And in tracks from his later work, D2, and the album D-Day, you can hear echoes of that same philosophy, that same insistence on truth over comfort, that same refusal to let the spotlight bleach away the shadows that make his art real. Min Yoongi once said in an interview, "I want to be a person who can honestly say what I think, who can express my emotions without being afraid." Most fans took that as a general life philosophy, and it is, but according to Mr. Lee, behind that statement was a very specific person who once sat across from him in a tiny studio in Mapo-gu and showed him that honesty, no matter how painful, is the only currency that never loses its value. That's number 6, and honestly, the weight of these stories is only getting heavier because coming up at number 5, Mr. Lee drops a revelation about a member whose alleged connection didn't just influence his music. It allegedly shaped the way he thinks about the world, about leadership, and about what it truly means to carry the dreams of millions on your shoulders. You're not going to want to miss this one. Number 5. RM. The intellectual bond that redefined his universe. Okay, so here's the thing about Kim Namjoon, and I need you to really sit with this before we dive in. This is a man with a verified IQ of 148, a man who taught himself English by watching Friends, a man who has quoted Nietzsche, Kafka, and Ursula K. Le Guin in casual interviews, a man who visits art museums alone in every city BTS tours in, and a man who the former president of South Korea once personally thanked for elevating Korean culture on the global stage. So when Mr. Lee revealed that the person RM was allegedly connected to wasn't a celebrity, wasn't an idol, wasn't anyone from the entertainment world at all, but was instead a graduate student studying comparative literature at one of Seoul's most prestigious universities, nobody who truly understands Kim Namjoon should have been surprised. And yet the details of this alleged connection are far more profound and far more transformative than a simple, the smart guy dated an intellectual headline could ever convey. Let's go back to where it all starts, because with Namjoon, context isn't just important, it's everything. Born in Ilsan, a planned satellite city just northwest of Seoul, Namjoon grew up in an environment that was distinctly middle-class, stable, and academically oriented. His parents valued education, his test scores were exceptional, and by every conventional measure, he was on track for the kind of life that Korean society rewards most: a prestigious university, a respectable career, a predictable trajectory from student to salaryman. But Namjoon's mind operated on frequencies that standardized tests couldn't measure. By his early teens, he was already deeply immersed in underground Korean hip-hop, writing lyrics that grappled with questions about identity, conformity, and the suffocating weight of societal expectations. He was listening to Nas, Eminem, and Epic High, dissecting their wordplay, studying their flow patterns, and building a vocabulary of rebellion that would eventually become the lyrical backbone of BTS. When he became a big-hit trainee and was positioned as the leader of a group that didn't even have a confirmed lineup yet, he was barely 16 years old, carrying the weight of a dream that most adults would buckle under. According to Mr. Lee, the alleged connection with this literature student began around 2015 to 2016, a period that is critically important in both BTS's timeline and Namjoon's personal evolution. This was the era of the most beautiful moment in life, the series that marked BTS's transition from a mid-tier idol group with a loyal but modest fanbase to a cultural phenomenon that was starting to crack the upper echelons of the Korean music industry. Namjoon was writing prolifically during this period, pouring his anxieties about youth, purpose, and the fleeting nature of happiness into songs that resonated with an entire generation. But Mr. Lee suggests that behind this creative explosion was a very specific catalyst. He alleges that Namjoon met this woman through a mutual acquaintance in Seoul's Hanam-dong Literary Circle, a loose, informal gathering of writers, academics, and artists who would meet in independent bookstores and small cafes to discuss literature, philosophy, and the intersection of art and society. Mr. Lee described her as someone who was completing her master's thesis on the concept of Han in modern Korean literature, and for those of you who don't know, Han is one of the most complex and untranslatable concepts in Korean culture. It refers to a collective feeling of unresolved grief, resentment, and longing that has been shaped by centuries of historical trauma, from colonial occupation to war to rapid industrialization. It's not just sadness, it's a profound, almost spiritual ache that permeates Korean art, music, and storytelling in ways that outsiders often struggle to fully grasp. And according to Mr. Lee, Namjoon was allegedly fascinated by her research, not just academically, but personally, because as the leader of BTS, he was carrying his own version of Han, the weight of 7 careers. Millions of fan expectations, industry pressures, and the constant, exhausting negotiation between his authentic self and the public persona the world demanded. What allegedly made this connection so significant wasn't romance in the conventional sense. Mr. Lee was careful to frame it as something closer to what the Greeks called a meeting of minds, a relationship built primarily on intellectual exchange, philosophical debate, and a shared obsession with understanding the human condition through art. According to Mr. Lee, they would allegedly spend entire afternoons in bookstores in Itaewon and Samcheong-dong, pulling books off shelves, reading passages aloud to each other, arguing about whether Haruki Murakami's emotional detachment was genius or cowardice, debating the merits of magical realism versus the stark honesty of confessional poetry. She allegedly introduced Namjoon to writers he hadn't encountered before, names from Latin American literature, post-colonial theory, and feminist philosophy that expanded his frame of reference far beyond the hip-hop and Western pop culture that had initially shaped his artistic worldview. And Namjoon, in return, allegedly challenged her academic perspective by arguing that popular music, particularly hip-hop and idol pop, could serve as legitimate vehicles for the same philosophical ideas she was studying in novels and poems. Now pay very close attention here, because this is where Mr. Lee's revelation starts to connect dots that fans have been debating for years. If you look at BTS's discography from 2016 onward, starting with Wings and accelerating through the Love Yourself trilogy, there is a dramatic and unmistakable deepening of literary and philosophical references in the group's music and visual storytelling. The Wings album was explicitly inspired by Hermann Hesse's novel Damien, a coming-of-age story about self-discovery and the rejection of societal norms. The Love Yourself series explored concepts drawn from Jungian psychology, particularly the idea of the persona, the shadow, and the process of individuation. The Map of the Soul era went even further, literally structuring an entire album series around Carl Jung's theories of the psyche. And while Namjoon has publicly credited various books and thinkers as influences, Mr. Lee alleges that the systematic integration of literary and philosophical frameworks into BTS's creative identity was significantly influenced by his conversations with this woman, that she essentially helped him build a bridge between the academic world of ideas and the popular world of music in a way that no one in the K-pop industry had ever attempted before. Consider this specific example that Mr. Lee highlighted. In Namjoon's 2018 speech at the United Nations General Assembly, where he spoke on behalf of UNICEF's Generation Unlimited initiative, he said the now iconic line, "I had many faults and I have many more fears. But I'm going to embrace myself as hard as I can, and I'm starting to love myself gradually, just little by little." That speech was praised worldwide for its vulnerability and emotional intelligence, and it became a defining moment not just for BTS, but for the entire conversation around mental health among young people globally. Mr. Lee alleges that the conceptual framework behind that speech, the idea of radical self-acceptance as a form of resistance against a culture that profits from insecurity, was something Namjoon had been developing in conversations with this woman for years. Drawing from her knowledge of existentialist philosophy and her own academic work on how Korean cultural concepts of collective identity often suppress individual emotional expression. The alleged connection reportedly evolved naturally over time, transitioning from its initial intensity into something quieter, but no less meaningful. Mr. Lee suggests that by 2018 or 2019, as BTS's global commitments became overwhelmingly consuming, the frequency of their meetings naturally decreased. But the intellectual impact remained permanently embedded in Namjoon's creative DNA. She eventually completed her doctoral studies and reportedly pursued an academic career, while Namjoon continued to channel the philosophical depth of their exchanges into his music, his art collection, and his public advocacy. Mr. Lee mentioned one particularly touching detail, that Namjoon allegedly kept a small, handwritten list of book recommendations she had given him tucked inside his personal journal, and that he would revisit that list whenever he felt creatively stuck or emotionally disconnected from the purpose behind his art. When you look at Namjoon's solo album, Indigo, released in December 2022, which he described as a record that archives his 20s, the fingerprints of this alleged connection are everywhere. The album is introspective, literary, and deeply concerned with the tension between public identity and private truth, themes that align precisely with the kind of intellectual exchange Mr. Lee described. Tracks like Wildflower, where Namjoon sings about wanting to live like a wildflower, quietly and beautifully without the need for validation, carry an emotional maturity that goes beyond typical pop music introspection. It sounds like the work of a man who didn't just read about philosophy, but lived it, argued it, and had it reflected back to him by someone who demanded that his intellect match his ambition. Number 4. Jean, the silent love that the world almost never knew. Stop everything you're doing right now, because what Mr. Lee revealed about Kim Seokjin is the kind of story that doesn't just tug at your heartstrings, it grabs them with both hands and refuses to let go. See, the thing about Jean that most casual observers get completely wrong is that they mistake his humor for simplicity. They see the dad jokes, the worldwide handsome confidence, the ridiculous windshield wiper laugh, and they assume that what you see is all there is. But anyone who has truly paid attention to Kim Seokjin over the years knows that behind that comedic armor is one of the most emotionally perceptive, deeply caring, and quietly sacrificial human beings in the entire K-pop landscape. And when Mr. Lee said that telling Jin's story almost broke him, he wasn't being dramatic. Because this alleged connection involves a dimension of heartbreak and selflessness that transcends the usual celebrity dating narrative and enters territory that feels genuinely, achingly human. According to Mr. Lee, Jean was allegedly involved with a woman who worked in the culinary industry, specifically a pastry chef who had trained in Paris and returned to Seoul to work at a high-end patisserie in the Gangnam district. Now immediately, if you know anything about Kim Seokjin beyond the stage persona, your brain is already making connections because this is a man whose love of food is not a variety show gimmick. It's a genuine, deeply rooted passion that has been part of his identity since childhood. Jean didn't just eat for content. He launched an entire mukbang series called Eat Jean years before mukbang became a global phenomenon. He has talked extensively about how cooking for others is his primary love language, how preparing a meal for someone is his way of saying things he can't express in words. His older brother, Kim Seok-young, runs a restaurant in Seoul that Jean invested in, and food has always been the thread that connects Jean to his sense of home, family, and emotional security. So the idea that he allegedly connected with someone who had dedicated her life to the art of creating food, someone who understood that a perfectly crafted dish can communicate love, comfort, and memory in ways that language simply cannot, is the kind of revelation that makes you realize you never truly knew Kim Seokjin at all. Let's establish the timeline that Mr. Lee laid out, because the context here is crucial. Jean was born in 1992 in Gwacheon, a small city just south of Seoul, and unlike most BTS members who entered the entertainment industry through a passion for music or dance, Jin's path was almost accidental. He was originally studying acting at Konkuk University, one of Korea's top private universities, when a big-hit entertainment scout spotted him literally stepping off a bus near the campus and was so struck by his visuals that he chased him down and handed him an audition card. Jean had no training in singing, no background in dance, no experience with the grueling trainee system, and yet he took the audition, passed, and found himself suddenly immersed in a world he had never planned to be part of. This origin story is important because it reveals something fundamental about Jin's character. He is someone who adapts, who rises to challenges not because he sought them out but because he refuses to let circumstances defeat him. And that same quiet resilience allegedly defined the way he handled his personal life. Mr. Lee places the beginning of this alleged connection around late 2016 to early 2017, a period when BTS was transitioning from national success to international recognition. The Wings album had just dropped, Blood, Sweat, and Tears was dominating charts, and the group was beginning to receive invitations to Western award shows and international press events. According to Mr. Lee, Jean allegedly met this pastry chef through a private dining event organized by mutual acquaintances in Seoul's upscale culinary scene. She had recently returned from a 3-year apprenticeship in Paris, working under a Michelin-starred pastry chef, and had brought back with her not just technical expertise, but a philosophy about food that resonated deeply with Jin's own beliefs. Mr. Lee described her as someone who viewed pastry making not as a commercial skill, but as an emotional art form. She believed that every dessert should tell a story. that the balance of sweetness and bitterness in a well-crafted pastry mirrors the balance of joy and sorrow in a well-lived life, and apparently, when she expressed this philosophy during that first meeting, Jean was completely captivated. What allegedly developed between them was, according to Mr. Lee, one of the most carefully hidden connections in BTS's entire history, and the reason for that secrecy reveals something profoundly important about Jin's character. As the eldest member of BTS, Jean carried a responsibility that extended far beyond his vocal parts and stage presence. In Korean culture, the role of the hyung, the eldest, is loaded with expectation. You are supposed to be the stabilizer, the protector, the one who absorbs pressure so that those younger than you don't have to. And Jean took this role with a seriousness that most fans only see glimpses of. He was the one who mediated conflicts within the group, the one who lightened the mood when tension became unbearable, the one who stayed up late to make sure the younger members ate properly during exhausting comeback schedules. According to Mr. Lee, Jean was hyper-aware that any personal scandal involving him could damage not just his own career, but the careers of 6 other people who depended on the group's collective image. And that awareness allegedly made him treat this connection with an almost painful level of caution and discretion. Mr. Lee described specific moments that paint a vivid picture of how this alleged relationship functioned in the shadows of idol life. He claims that Jean would allegedly visit her patisserie late at night, after the shop had closed, sometimes arriving after midnight following a full day of schedules, just to sit in the kitchen and watch her work. Not to talk, not to eat, but simply to exist in a space that felt real, a space that smelled like butter and vanilla and caramelized sugar instead of stage makeup and practice room sweat. Mr. Lee suggests that for Jean, those quiet hours in that kitchen represented something he couldn't find anywhere else in his life, a sense of normalcy, of being treated not as an idol or a visual or a commodity, but as a person. Just a regular person who could sit on a flour-dusted counter and feel the warmth of an oven and forget, even for a moment, the enormity of the world waiting outside that door. And honestly, when you frame it that way, the image is so tender and so heartbreaking at the same time that it's almost difficult to process. The emotional weight of this story intensifies when you consider what Mr. Lee revealed about how this alleged connection influenced Jin's most personal musical work. In 2019, Jean released Epiphany as part of the Love Yourself Answer album, a song that contains the lyrics, "I'm the one I should love in this world, shining me. The precious soul of mine, I finally realized so I love me." Not so perfect, but so beautiful. On the surface, it's an anthem of self-acceptance that aligns perfectly with BTS's Love Yourself message. But Mr. Lee alleges that the emotional breakthrough captured in Epiphany was directly connected to a conversation Jean had with this woman, during which she allegedly told him that he spent so much time taking care of everyone else, protecting the group, shielding the younger members, absorbing criticism so others wouldn't have to, that he had forgotten to extend that same compassion to himself. According to Mr. Lee, she said something along the lines of, "You bake love into everything you give to others, but you never save a slice for yourself," and that metaphor, so perfectly suited to who she was and what she did, allegedly became the emotional catalyst for one of Jin's most important artistic statements. The alleged relationship reportedly faced its most difficult period during 2019 to 2020, as BTS reached a level of global fame that made any semblance of private life virtually impossible. Their every movement was tracked by fan sites, every outing photographed, every interaction analyzed and dissected across social media platforms in dozens of languages. Mr. Lee describes this period as one where Jean allegedly struggled deeply with the contradiction between the love he felt and the impossibility of expressing it openly, between the desire to be a complete human being with a full emotional life and the reality that the industry had constructed a version of him that left no room for such complexity. According to Mr. Lee, the decision to step back from the connection was not mutual in the way J-Hope's or Suga's were. It was a choice Jean allegedly made alone, a sacrifice he believed was necessary to protect both her from the invasive scrutiny of fan culture and the group from the potential fallout of a dating revelation during their peak commercial period. Number 3. Jimin, the consuming flame that nearly rewrote everything. Listen very carefully, because what I'm about to share isn't just another revelation on this list. It is, according to Mr. Lee himself, the single most emotionally volatile story he uncovered in his entire investigation into the personal lives of BTS's 7 members, and the reason he placed it this high on the list isn't because of who was involved or how long it lasted, but because of what it almost cost, what it nearly destroyed, and how close the world came to losing Park Jimin from BTS. Entirely. Yes, you read that correctly. According to Mr. Lee, the alleged connection in Jimin's life was so intense, so emotionally consuming, that there was a period, a very real and very terrifying period, where Jimin allegedly considered walking away from the group. Walking away from everything he had built, and that fact alone should tell you that we are no longer in the territory of quiet romances and intellectual partnerships. This is something else entirely. Before we dive into the heart of this revelation, you need to understand Park Jimin at his core, because without that understanding, the magnitude of what Mr. Lee described simply won't land the way it should. Born in 1995 in Busan, South Korea's second-largest city, a port town known for its rugged coastline, its fiercely proud locals, and its reputation for producing people with an intensity that matches the crashing waves of Haeundae Beach, Jimin was a prodigy in the truest sense of the word. He didn't just dance, he inhabited movement the way a poet inhabits language. Enrolled at Busan High School of Arts as the top student in the contemporary dance department, he was the kind of performer who could make a room fall silent not through technical precision alone, but through the sheer emotional weight he channeled through every gesture, every extension of his fingertips, every controlled fall and recovery. His teachers reportedly said that watching Jimin dance was like watching someone have a conversation with his own soul in front of an audience, and that rawness, that inability to separate his emotions from his art, is both his greatest gift and, as Mr. Lee's revelation suggests, his most dangerous vulnerability. According to Mr. Lee, the person Jimin was allegedly connected to as a young Korean actress, someone who had begun making waves in the K-drama industry around 2016 to 2017 with supporting roles in several critically acclaimed television dramas. Mr. Lee did not reveal her full identity, but described her as someone who was approximately the same age as Jimin, had trained at one of Korea's top performing arts programs, and possessed the same kind of raw emotional transparency that defined Jimin's artistry. She wasn't a top-tier celebrity at the time, not a household name, but she was respected within the industry for her ability to deliver performances that felt uncomfortably real. The kind of actress who didn't just play characters, but bled into them, who left pieces of herself in every role and carried pieces of every role with her long after the cameras stopped rolling. And according to Mr. Lee, it was precisely this shared characteristic, this mutual inability to build walls between who they were and what they felt, that made their alleged connection both extraordinary and ultimately devastating. Mr. Lee places their first meeting around mid-2017, during a period when BTS was experiencing the kind of exponential growth that transforms not just careers, but identities. The Spring Day era had cemented BTS as artists capable of profound emotional storytelling. The Billboard Music Awards had just recognized them on the global stage for the first time, and Jimin personally was navigating a complex internal landscape that few people around him fully understood. On stage, he was the performer who could bring tens of thousands of people to tears with a single sustained note in Lie, a song about the suffocating weight of deception and the fear of being exposed as a fraud. Offstage, according to Mr. Lee, Jimin was battling the very demons that song described, struggling with perfectionism so severe that he would practice choreography until his body physically gave out, restricting his food intake to maintain an image standard that was destroying him from the inside, and wrestling with a persistent, gnawing feeling that no matter how much he achieved, it would never be enough to justify the space he occupied. It was in this psychological state, according to Mr. Lee, that Jimin allegedly encountered this actress at a private gathering hosted by mutual friends in the entertainment industry. An informal dinner in Cheongdam-dong where young artists from different corners of the Korean entertainment world occasionally crossed paths away from the public eye. Mr. Lee describes their first conversation as something that hit both of them with an almost physical force, not because it was romantic or flirtatious, but because it was honest in a way that neither of them had experienced with anyone else in their respective industries. She allegedly told Jimin within the first hour of meeting him that she could see he was exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with sleep, and instead of deflecting with his usual charm or self-deprecating humor, Jimin reportedly looked at her and simply said, "Yeah, I am." According to Mr. Lee, that single moment of unguarded admission was the spark that ignited everything that followed. What allegedly developed over the subsequent months was not a gentle, carefully managed connection like the ones we've discussed in previous entries. Mr. Lee described it as a whirlwind, a gravitational pull so powerful that it began to reshape Jimin's priorities in ways that alarmed those closest to him. According to Mr. Lee, Jimin allegedly began finding every possible excuse to carve out time from BTS's merciless schedule, arriving late to practice sessions, appearing distracted during recording sessions, and displaying a restlessness that the other members and Big Hit's management team noticed, but struggled to address directly. She was reportedly dealing with her own version of the same crisis, pouring herself so completely into her roles that she was losing track of where the characters ended and she began. And together they allegedly created a space where two people who had never learned how to exist at half intensity could finally stop performing for the world and simply be consumed by each other without apology. Here is where Mr. Lee's account becomes genuinely alarming and reveals why he said this story nearly changed BTS's history. According to Mr. Lee, sometime in late 2017, during the preparation for BTS's Love Yourself, Her and Love Yourself, Tear eras, Jimin allegedly had a conversation with one of the senior Big Hit staff members in which he expressed uncertainty about his future with the group. Not because he didn't love BTS, not because he didn't value the bond with his members, but because the emotional toll of maintaining the idol facade while simultaneously experiencing the most intense personal connection of his life was tearing him apart. He allegedly felt that he was failing at both, that he couldn't give BTS the full commitment they deserved while his heart and mind were being pulled in another direction, and that the only honest thing to do was to step back before his divided attention hurt the people who depended on him. Mr. Lee claims that when this information reached Si Hyuk, the founder and chairman of Big Hit Entertainment, it triggered an emergency response within the company because losing Jimin, arguably BTS's most emotionally resonant performer and one of the group's most popular members globally, during the most critical growth period in their career would have been nothing short of catastrophic. According to Mr. Lee, what followed was a series of deeply personal conversations between Jimin and his fellow BTS members, particularly with V, his closest friend since their trainee days, and with RM, who as leader carried the responsibility of holding the group together. Mr. Lee did not reveal the specific details of these conversations, out of respect for their privacy, but he indicated that they were raw, emotional, and transformative. The other members allegedly didn't respond with anger or ultimatums. They responded with the kind of unconditional support that can only come from people who have literally grown up together, who have shared cramped dormitory rooms and empty bank accounts, and the terror of potential failure. Mr. Lee suggests that it was ultimately the depth of BTS's brotherhood, the realization that these 6 men needed him not as a performer, but as a person, that pulled Jimin back from the edge of a decision that would have fundamentally altered K-pop history. The alleged connection with the actress reportedly did not survive this turning point. Mr. Lee describes the ending not as a breakup, but as a kind of emotional implosion. Two people who burned too brightly together discovering that the same intensity that made them extraordinary also made them unsustainable. She allegedly understood, perhaps better than anyone else could have, because as an actress she knew what it meant to give everything to a role and then have to let it go when the final scene was shot. According to Mr. Lee, their last conversation was devastatingly simple. She allegedly told Jimin, "You don't belong to me, you belong to them, and that's not a tragedy. That's your purpose." And Jimin reportedly couldn't respond because he knew she was right and hated that she was right in equal measure. Number 2. V, the reckless heart that refused to hide. Every single story we've covered on this list so far has one thing in common: secrecy. J-Hope kept his connection tucked away in the quiet streets of Gwangju. Suga buried his in the dimly lit studios of Mapogu. RM folded his into the pages of books nobody else would read. Jean hid his behind a laugh so perfect that nobody ever questioned what it was covering. Jimin's almost burned everything to the ground precisely because he couldn't contain it. But Kim Taehyung, the man the world knows as V, did something that none of his brothers did, something that Mr. Lee describes as the single most audacious emotional act any BTS member ever committed during the height of their fame, and that is this. According to Mr. Lee, V didn't hide. He refused to. In an industry designed to erase the personal lives of its biggest stars, in a culture where dating scandals have ended careers overnight, Kim Taehyung allegedly loved openly, recklessly, and with a defiance that terrified everyone around him. And the person at the center of this storm was someone the K-pop world already suspected but never fully understood, a fellow idol whose own fame made the situation not just risky but genuinely unprecedented. To understand why V's alleged approach was so radical, so fundamentally different from every other member on this list, you need to understand who Kim Taehyung is beneath the stage name, because V is not a persona the way most idol identities are personas. Most K-pop stars construct a version of themselves for public consumption, a carefully calibrated character designed to maximize appeal and minimize controversy. But Taehyung has always operated differently. Born in 1995 in Daegu, raised partially in Gyeochang, a rural farming community in South Gyeongsang province, Taehyung grew up in an environment that was about as far from the manufactured glamour of Seoul's entertainment industry as you can possibly imagine. His family were farmers, his grandparents worked the land, and young Taehyung spent his childhood running through rice paddies, catching insects, and developing a relationship with the natural world that permanently embedded in him a kind of unfiltered, almost childlike authenticity that no amount of idol training could polish away. When he arrived at Big Hit as a trainee, he was famously the hidden member, someone the company kept secret from the public until the very last moment before debut, partly for marketing reasons but also, according to industry insiders, because they genuinely didn't know how to package him. He was too unpredictable, too emotionally transparent, too stubbornly himself to fit neatly into any of the conventional idol archetypes. That stubbornness, that almost pathological refusal to be anything other than exactly who he is in any given moment, is what Mr. Lee identifies as the defining characteristic of Taehyung's alleged romantic life. According to Mr. Lee, Taehyung's connection was with a prominent female idol from one of K-pop's biggest girl groups, someone whose career trajectory had mirrored BTS's in many ways, rising from a competitive debut to global superstardom. Navigating the impossible expectations placed on female idols in an industry that is exponentially more restrictive and punishing toward women than it is toward men. Mr. Lee indicated that this was someone the public had already linked to Taehyung through leaked photographs and media speculation, and while he stopped short of confirming the exact identity, the details he provided left very little room for ambiguity, describing her as someone who had become a global fashion icon in her own right, someone who moved between the worlds of music, modeling, and luxury brand ambassadorship with an ease that matched Taehyung's own boundary-defying presence in those spaces. What sets this story apart from everything else on this list is not who was involved, but how Taehyung allegedly chose to handle it. Mr. Lee recounts that when the alleged relationship began, reportedly around 2021 to 2022, Taehyung was fully aware of the catastrophic consequences that public exposure could bring. He had watched other idols' careers crumble under the weight of dating scandals. He knew that ARMY, despite being one of the most devoted fan bases in history, contained a vocal faction that viewed any romantic involvement as a betrayal. He understood that her fanbase carried the same volatile potential. He knew that the business machinery of both groups, the endorsement deals, the brand partnerships, the carefully negotiated image contracts, could all be jeopardized by a single confirmed photograph. He knew all of this, and according to Mr. Lee, he simply did not care, not because he was reckless in the immature sense, but because he possessed a moral conviction that hiding love was a form of dishonesty that he fundamentally could not reconcile with the person he believed himself to be. Mr. Lee describes multiple instances where Taehyung allegedly pushed back against the advice of managers, publicists, and even his own members who urged him to be more cautious. In one particularly revealing anecdote, Mr. Lee claims that after a set of photographs allegedly showing Taehyung and this person together began circulating online, triggering the predictable firestorm of fan reactions, media speculation, and corporate panic, Taehyung was called into a meeting with senior HYBE management, the parent company that Big Hit had evolved into, and was reportedly told in very direct terms that the situation needed to be contained, that a statement needed to be issued, that the narrative needed to be controlled. According to Mr. Lee, Taehyung sat through the entire meeting in silence, listened to every argument about brand protection and fan management and market impact, and when it was his turn to speak, he allegedly said something along the lines of, "I've spent my entire career telling ARMY to love themselves. How can I do that if I'm ashamed of who I love?" Mr. Lee says that the room went completely silent after that, because there was simply no corporate talking point that could counter the raw, unassailable logic of a man who had taken his own group's message and turned it into a personal creed. This philosophical dimension is what elevates Taehyung's story beyond a simple dating revelation and into something that touches the very foundations of what it means to be an idol in the modern K-pop ecosystem. The Love Yourself era, which defined BTS's commercial peak and cultural legacy, was built on the message that self-acceptance is the highest form of courage, that hiding your true self is the deepest form of self-harm, and that authentic love, whether directed inward or outward, is the only force powerful enough to overcome the fears that keep people small. Taehyung, according to Mr. Lee, wasn't just performing that message on stage. He was living it in the most dangerous arena possible, his own private life. And the tension between the industry's demand for concealment and Taehyung's insistence on authenticity created a conflict that went far beyond typical celebrity gossip and entered the realm of genuine ideological confrontation. Mr. Lee also revealed the emotional toll this stance allegedly took on the people around Taehyung, particularly the woman involved. According to Mr. Lee, she occupied an even more precarious position than Taehyung did, because the K-pop industry's double standards meant that while a male idol caught dating might face temporary backlash, a female idol in the same situation could face career-ending consequences. The scrutiny directed at female idols' personal lives is orders of magnitude more intense and more vicious than what their male counterparts endure. And Mr. Lee suggests that the weight of this imbalance was something Taehyung was painfully aware of and deeply troubled by. He allegedly told close friends that the thing that kept him up at night wasn't the fear of what exposure would do to his own career, but the knowledge that the person he cared about would bear the heavier punishment simply because of the industry's inherent misogyny. And that sense of injustice reportedly fueled his defiance even further rather than tempering it. The alleged relationship's most significant cultural moment came when photographs were definitively leaked and spread across every corner of the internet, generating millions of reactions, trending worldwide on social media, and forcing both agencies into crisis management mode. Mr. Lee describes the aftermath as a case study in how the K-pop industry handles situations that threaten its carefully maintained illusions. Statements were issued, narratives were shaped, and the official machinery of image control swung into action. But according to Mr. Lee, behind the corporate responses, something far more human was happening. He claims that Taehyung's reaction to the public exposure was not panic or regret, but a strange, almost peaceful resolve, as if the thing he had been silently fighting for, the right to exist fully and honestly as a human being rather than a product, had finally been forced into the open whether the industry was ready for it or not. Number 1. Jungkook, the first love that the whole world watched but never understood. Here we are. The final revelation. The summit of a countdown that has taken us through the hidden emotional landscapes of 6 extraordinary men, from J-Hope's quiet dance floor connection in Gwangju to Suga's midnight creative collision in Mapogu, From RM's intellectual awakening in the bookstores of Seoul to Jin's heartbreaking sacrifice wrapped in laughter, from Jimin's consuming flame that nearly ended everything to V's defiant refusal to treat love as something shameful. Each story has peeled back a layer of the carefully constructed idol image to reveal the raw, messy, beautiful humanity underneath. But Mr. Lee was adamant, absolutely insistent, that the story of Jungkook belongs at the very top of this list, not because it's the most dramatic or the most scandalous or the most intellectually complex, but because it represents something that none of the other stories do. Something that he says cuts to the very heart of what it means to be the most famous young person on the planet and the price that fame extracts from the one thing every human being deserves to experience freely and without judgment, the simple, terrifying, world-altering miracle of falling in love for the very first time. You cannot understand Jungkook's story without first understanding something that the world often forgets, because his talent makes it so easy to overlook. Jungkook was a child. When he left his family in Busan and moved to Seoul to become a big-hit entertainment trainee, he was 15 years old. Not 15 in the way that Western teenagers are 15, with driver's permits and high school dances and the luxury of making mistakes in relative anonymity, but 15 in the way that only a K-pop trainee can be 15, which is to say that his adolescence was immediately and permanently confiscated by an industry that had no use for it. From the moment he walked through Big Hit's doors, his body belonged to choreographers, his voice belonged to vocal coaches, his face belonged to stylists, his time belonged to managers, and his image belonged to a company that was betting its financial future on 7 boys who hadn't even proven they could survive a debut stage. Jungkook was the youngest of those 7 boys, the maknae, the baby of the group, and he was so shy, so overwhelmed, so visibly terrified during those early days that the older members have spoken publicly about how they worried he might not make it through training. But he did make it. Not just through training, but through debut, through the years of struggling for recognition, through the slow climb from a small company's underdog group to the best-selling act in the history of Korean music. And he didn't just survive, he excelled at everything he touched with an almost supernatural versatility that earned him the nickname Golden Maknae, a title that sounds like a compliment but carries within it a weight that most people never consider. To be golden means you are not allowed to be anything less. To be the maknae who is golden means that the youngest person in the room must also be the most flawless, the most adaptable, the most willing to absorb the expectations of everyone around him and transform them into performance. Jungkook could sing, he could dance, he could rap, he could draw, he could edit videos, he could do athletics, he could learn any skill with frightening speed, and the world celebrated this as if it were a gift rather than recognizing that it was also a cage. Because when you can do everything, everyone expects you to do everything, and the space left over for you to simply be a young man figuring out who he is shrinks until it almost doesn't exist at all. According to Mr. Lee, it was in this vanishingly small space of personal identity that Jungkook's alleged connection took root. And the person Mr. Lee identified was not an idol, not an actress, not a dancer, not a writer, not anyone from the entertainment industry whatsoever. She was, according to Mr. Lee, an ordinary young woman. A university student in Seoul, studying something entirely unrelated to music or performance, someone who worked a part-time job at a cafe, someone who took the subway to class, someone who worried about exams and student loans and whether she could afford to eat out with her friends on the weekend. Someone who was, in every measurable way, living the exact kind of normal, unremarkable, beautifully mundane life that Jungkook had been denied since the age of 15. And according to Mr. Lee, that normalcy wasn't just part of the attraction, it was the entire foundation of it, because what Jungkook allegedly found in this woman wasn't passion or intellectual stimulation or creative partnership. It was something far more fundamental, a window into the life he never got to live. Mr. Lee places the timeline of this alleged connection around 2018 to 2019, a period when BTS was at the absolute zenith of their global dominance. They had just become the first K-pop act to speak at the United Nations. Fake Love and Idol were shattering records. They were selling out stadiums in continents that had never before hosted a Korean act. And Jungkook's face was being recognized on streets from Tokyo to Toronto to Sao Paulo. He was 21 years old, and he was arguably the most famous 21-year-old on Earth, and according to Mr. Lee, he was also profoundly lonely in a way that fame doesn't just fail to cure, but actively worsens. Mr. Lee describes a young man who had spent his entire adolescence inside a bubble of schedules, dormitories, practice rooms, and cameras, who had never experienced the ordinary rites of passage that most people take for granted, who had never walked a girl home from school, never had an awkward first date at a movie theater, never experienced the stomach-churning nervousness of sending a text and waiting for a reply, never been allowed to be bad at something romantic and clumsy and human. Because the idol system demands perfection even in the spaces where imperfection is the entire point. According to Mr. Lee, they met through an almost absurdly ordinary circumstance. Not at a private industry event, not through an exclusive introduction, but allegedly at a small, unremarkable cafe in a quiet neighborhood of Seoul where Jungkook occasionally went specifically because it was a place where nobody expected to see an idol. A place where he could sit in a corner with a baseball cap pulled low and pretend, just for an hour, that he was no different from anyone else in the room. Mr. Lee claims that she didn't recognize him at first, or if she did, she didn't react the way people usually reacted, and that absence of the usual wide-eyed, phone-grabbing, "Oh my God, are you Jungkook?" response was apparently what caught his attention more than anything else. She treated him like a regular customer. She asked him what he wanted to order. She made small talk the way baristas make small talk with regulars. And according to Mr. Lee, Jungkook kept coming back, not because the coffee was exceptional, but because those brief, unremarkable interactions gave him something that sold-out stadium shows and millions of streaming numbers never could. The feeling of being nobody special and the strange, intoxicating relief that comes with it. So there it is, all 7 stories laid bare, from number 7 all the way down to number 1, and if you've made it this far, I want you to take a moment and just sit with everything you've heard, because the individual stories are powerful on their own. But when you pull back and look at them together, as a collective portrait of 7 young men navigating the intersection of extraordinary fame and ordinary humanity, something much larger and much more significant comes into focus. This has been your complete countdown. 7 members. 7 stories. 7 windows into the hearts of 7 men who changed the world not because they were perfect, but because they were real. Thank you for staying until the very end. Thank you for listening not just with your ears, but with your hearts. And the next time someone asks you why BTS matters, you'll know the answer. Because they loved, and they let that love live in their music, and through their music, they taught an entire generation that loving honestly, even when it's dangerous, even when it costs you everything, is the bravest thing a person can do. This is the end of our journey. Take care of yourselves, take care of each other, and never, ever be ashamed of who you love. See you in the next one. Peace. That's the complete number 1, Jungkook plus the full closing summary. The channel is officially closed.